The billionaire watched in disbelief as his German shepherd, Shadow, moved like a shadow itself, too precise, too calculating, too aware. This wasn't just intelligence, it was something more. And now the FBI wanted him for a mission no human could survive. Wealth meant control. At least that's what Adrian Calloway had always believed. His empire sprawling across industries from finance to tech was built on precision, on knowing every move before it happened. But tonight, as he sat alone in his grand estate, staring at his German shepherd, Shadow, he felt an unfamiliar sensation: doubt. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was an anomaly, a mystery Adrian had spent years trying to understand. Bred from a lineage of elite working dogs, Shadow had always exhibited a level of intelligence that bordered on unsettling. At first, Adrian dismissed it as clever training. But then, there were too many moments, where Shadow seemed to anticipate things before they happened. Like that time in Zurich when Adrian's car was about to be sabotaged, Shadow refused to get in, moments before a bomb was discovered under the chassis, or the way he recognized people's intent before they even spoke. No formal training could explain it. And yet, Adrian never spoke of it to anyone. Some things were better left unexplored. Tonight, though, something felt different. The room was silent except for the crackling fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the dark wood-paneled walls. Shadow sat near the glass doors leading to the terrace, his ears perked, his gaze locked on something unseen. Adrian followed the dog's line of sight but saw nothing, just the vast stretch of his property, moonlight spilling over the stone pathways. Yet, a chill crept up his spine. Shadow wasn't reacting to something outside. He was reacting to the phone. A phone that never rang. A secure, encrypted line Adrian had installed for emergency phone only a handful of people even knew existed. Then, it happened. A single ring. Shadow growled, low and guttural, as if sensing something Adrian couldn't. Adrian hesitated for just a second before answering. "Calloway," he said, his voice clipped. A pause. Then, a voice calm, authoritative, and laced with something unsettling. "Mr. Calloway, we need the dog." The call that changed everything. Adrian's grip on the receiver tightened. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." The voice remained impassive. "We need Shadow. There's a situation that requires his unique abilities." For a moment, Adrian considered hanging up. He didn't deal with government agencies, especially not the FBI. Their world was one of surveillance, red tape, and ulterior motives. His world was control, precision, and Shadow was his. "I don't lend out my assets," Adrian said coolly, his free hand absently running over Shadow's head. The man on the other end exhaled sharply. "Mr. Calloway, let's not pretend you don't know what your dog is." Adrian's breath hitched. Shadow shifted beside him, his sharp eyes flicking between Adrian and the phone, as if he too understood the weight of the moment. "We've been monitoring certain anomalies," the agent continued. "Patterns that don't fit. Shadow is one of them. A dog with an IQ that surpasses human predictions, an ability to recognize patterns faster than AI, and, if reports are to be believed, a level of intuition that cannot be explained scientifically." Adrian clenched his jaw. Of course they had been watching. The government was never blind to outliers. "There's a mission," the agent said finally. "Something no human can pull off, but your dog might." Adrian exhaled slowly. Shadow sat at his feet, eerily still, waiting. He already knew the answer. A past he never questioned. Adrian's mind drifted back to the day he first brought Shadow home. It had been a cold morning, the sky overcast as he arrived at the elite breeding facility. The owner, a grizzled ex-military handler, had met him with wary eyes. "You sure you want this one?" the man had asked, his voice thick with hesitation. "He's different." Adrian had smirked. "Different how?" "He's not just smart, he understands things." At the time, Adrian thought it was breeder exaggeration, a sales tactic to make the dog seem more impressive. But as the months passed, he saw it firsthand. Shadow didn't just follow commands, she anticipated them. When Adrian traveled, Shadow knew his flight schedules before Adrian even packed. When a stranger approached, Shadow could assess their intentions in seconds, distinguishing a harmless bystander from someone with ulterior motives. And then there were the dreams. On multiple occasions, Adrian had woken up to Shadow staring at him in the dead of night, as if he had just seen something Adrian hadn't yet lived through. The next day, something major always happened, whether it was a stock market crash, a business betrayal, or a near-fatal accident. Shadow was more than just intelligent. He was something else entirely. And now the FBI wanted him. "I need more details," Adrian said finally, his voice low. "What exactly do you need Shadow for?" A brief pause. Then the agent replied, "A kidnapping." Adrian's expression darkened. "A high-profile scientist has been taken," the agent continued. "He was working on classified neurological research before he disappeared. Every attempt to track him has failed. Surveillance, drones, intelligence assets, nothing is working." Adrian frowned. "And you think Shadow can find him?" There was a beat of silence. Then the agent said something that sent a chill through Adrian's veins. "We don't just think so, we know so. Shadow has already led us to missing persons before, ones you never even knew were being watched." Adrian's fingers tensed against the receiver. He had always suspected Shadow's abilities went beyond normal canine instincts. But the idea that the FBI had been tracking his dog without his knowledge? That was a different level of intrusion. "This isn't a request, Mr. Calloway," the agent finally said. "This is a national security matter. You and Shadow will be briefed in the next 24 hours. Adrian swallowed the bitter taste of powerlessness. For the first time in his life, control was slipping through his fingers. And the only one who seemed to understand that was Shadow. The dog looked up at him, eyes gleaming with something almost human, as if he already knew what Adrian's answer would be. And maybe, just maybe did. The drive to the FBI headquarters was eerily silent. Adrian sat in the back of the black SUV, Shadow beside him, motionless except for the occasional flick of his ears. Outside, the city pulsed with Lifenian signs flashing in the distance, cars weaving through traffic, pedestrians lost in their own worlds. But inside the vehicle, there was only quiet tension. Adrian wasn't used to being summoned. He was the kind of man who issued commands, not the kind who followed them. But tonight, the balance of power had shifted, and he hated it. The FBI agent sitting across from him, a stone-faced man who had introduced himself only as Agent Monroe, typed something on a tablet, glancing up occasionally. "You don't talk much," Adrian finally muttered. Monroe didn't look up. "I don't have much to say." Adrian smirked. "I'm sure you do. You just don't want me to know it." Monroe's fingers paused over the screen for a fraction of a second before he resumed typing. That tiny hesitation told Adrian everything he needed to know. They weren't telling him everything. Shadow, meanwhile, remained eerily still. Adrian had seen his dog in all kinds of environments, luxurious hotels, chaotic city streets, even corporate boardrooms. But this was different. Shadow wasn't just calm. He was waiting. For what, Adrian didn't know. The car pulled into an underground parking garage where two more agents stood waiting by a private elevator. No words were exchanged. Monroe stepped out first, nodding for Adrian to follow. Shadow moved first, his sleek frame cutting through the dimly lit space like a phantom. The agents stiffened as the dog passed, their hands twitching toward their weapons. Adrian saw it. Shadow saw it. But neither of them acknowledged it. The hidden facility. The elevator ride was too long for an ordinary FBI field office. When the doors finally opened, Adrian stepped into a space that looked nothing like what he had expected. There were no cubicles, no dull beige desks or bulletin boards with pinned-up reports. Instead, the walls were lined with screens, each one displaying something different: Theat maps, biometric scans, surveillance footage from locations Adrian didn't recognize. In the center of the room stood a massive glass window, revealing a darkened lab on the other side. And inside that lab, a cage. Adrian's stomach tightened. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. A woman in a crisp black suit stepped forward. Her presence was different from Monroe Skolder, more clinical. "Mr. Calloway," she said smoothly. "I'm Director Evelyn Hart. Welcome to Division 17. Adrian turned to Monroe. "You said this was a kidnapping case." "It is," Hart replied, her sharp eyes flicking to Shadow. "But it's also much more than that." Shadow, who had been silent until now, let out a low, guttural growl. Not at Monroe, not at the cage. At Hart. For the first time since the call, Adrian felt something close to fear. Shadow never growled unless there was a reason. Hart's lips twitched. "Interesting," she murmured, folding her arms. He knows, doesn't he? Adrian's patience snapped. Knows what? Hart turned toward the glass window, nodding at the caged-off section of the lab. That, she said simply. Adrian stepped forward, and the moment he saw what was inside the cage, his blood ran cold. Waiting. Adrian exhaled. I don't care what he was made for. His grip on Hart's collar tightened. He's mine. For the first time, Hart's composure faltered. Then, a new voice crackled through Monroe's earpiece. Sir, they're falling back. Adrian frowned. What? Monroe pressed a hand to his radio. Repeat that. The enemy forces, they're retreating. Hart's smirk returned. Of course they are. Adrian didn't like that tone. Why? Hart turned her head slightly. Toward Shadow. We were never the real threat, she murmured. Adrian's pulse stopped. Shadow's ears twitched. He turned, eyes locking onto something beyond the corridor. And then, the lights died completely. In the pitch-black darkness, a single sound echoed through the facility. Not human. Not machine. Something else. Something worse. Hart's whisper was almost gleeful. You really thought he was the only one left? Adrian felt it before he saw it. A presence. A shape. Moving through the dark. Shadow's growl rumbled deep in his chest. For the first time in his life, Adrian saw something in his dog's expression he had never seen before. Fear. And then, a pair of glowing eyes blinked open in the darkness. The other one. At first glance, it looked like a dog. A large German shepherd, its coat sleek and dark, its posture rigid. But as Adrian looked closer, he realized something was off. The way it held itself too still. The way its eyes moved too precise. And then there was the way it looked at Shadow. Not like a dog recognizing another dog. Like a mirror recognizing its reflection. Adrian's throat went dry. What is this? Hart exhaled, crossing her arms. A classified research project. Years ago, a defense contractor developed a prototype of biologically enhanced intelligence model. The idea was to create a hybrid between canine instincts and human cognitive function. Adrian turned sharply. You're saying that's not a regular dog? Hart's lips curled slightly. What do you think? Adrian's gaze flicked back to the caged animal. It looked like a dog, but no, there was something else there. A sharpness in its eyes. A calculation that shouldn't exist in any living creature, let alone a canine. His stomach clenched. He looked down at Shadow. Shadow, who had always been just a little too smart. Shadow, who had always seemed to know things. Shadow, who was staring at the creature in the cage and not blinking. Adrian took a step back. Hart's voice was calm. You see it now, don't you? Adrian barely heard her. His mind was racing. For years, he had assumed Shadow was simply a genetic anomaly, a once-in-a-lifetime prodigy of a dog. But what if he wasn't? What if Shadow wasn't supposed to exist at all? Hart continued. This prototype was created to be the perfect tracking asset, more effective than human agents, more reliable than technology. It was designed to operate beyond human intelligence constraints. And it worked, too well, actually. Adrian frowned. What do you mean, too well? Hart finally turned to face him fully. The original project was shut down after an incident. Adrian exhaled sharply. What kind of incident? Hart studied him for a moment before responding. It started with a dog going rogue. A chill ran through Adrian's veins. His pulse thundered as his mind made the connection. Shadow, he whispered. Hart gave him a knowing look. You were never supposed to own him, Mr. Calloway. Shadow wasn't bred. He was engineered. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder. Shadow, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, stepped forward, staring at the caged animal with an intensity that sent shivers down Adrian's spine. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Hart turned back to the glass. The kidnapped scientist, she continued, was one of the original researchers. Before he vanished, he sent us a message, just one sentence. She pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward Adrian. It was a blurry screenshot of a hastily written note. Adrian read it once, then twice. They're coming for the other one. His breath caught in his throat. Hart's voice was steady, but urgent. Now do you understand, Mr. Calloway? She turned to Shadow, then back to Adrian. They weren't after the scientist. He was just a means to an end. They were after the asset. She exhaled. They were after your dog. Adrian's mind reeled. For years, he had chalked up Shadow's intelligence to superior breeding, a stroke of genetic luck. But now, standing in a covert government facility, staring at another Dogon that wasn't quite a dog, he felt his grip on reality slipping. Shadow wasn't just a prodigy. He was a secret, a classified one. And someone was coming for him. A sharp knock on the glass snapped Adrian back. Director Hart turned toward the door as another agent entered, his face pale with urgency. They breached the outer perimeter, he said. Adrian stiffened. Who? Hart's expression darkened. We don't know yet, but they're good. Shadow's ears twitched. He turned toward the entrance before the alarms even blared. Adrian barely had time to react before the entire facility went on lockdown. Red lights, blaring sirens, agents scrambling. We need to move, Hart snapped, striding toward the exit. Now. Adrian followed, his pulse pounding. But Shadow? Shadow was calm. Too calm. Like he knew this was coming. The attack. The gunfire started before they reached the security checkpoint. Pop, pop, pop. Suppressed shots. Silent, precise. Hart shoved Adrian into a side corridor as Monroe barked into his radio. We have hostiles inside. Repeat, we have hostiles inside. The response crackled back, garbled and panicked. Sector 4, breach taking heavy fire. Silence. Adrian's stomach clenched. Whoever these people were, they were cutting through the facility like a knife through paper. And they were here for Shadow. We can't hold them off forever, Monroe growled. We need to secure the asset. Adrian turned sharply. He's not an asset, he's my dog. Hart shot him a look. Then act like you want to keep him alive. A flicker of movement. Adrian barely had time to register the figure in black tactical gear emerging from the shadows before Shadow lunged. A blur of fur and teeth. A gurgled scream. The soldier went down hard, his gun skidding across the floor as Shadow's jaws locked around his throat. Adrian had seen his dog take down threats before, but never like this. Never with this level of precision. It was surgical, calculated, human. Shadow didn't just incapacitate the man. He disabled him, striking the exact points that would prevent movement without causing a fatal injury. Hart and Monroe exchanged a glance. Adrian saw it. They weren't surprised. Because they already knew. Shadow released the soldier and turned back, eyes gleaming, waiting. We need to get him out of here, Hart said. Adrian shook his head. We need to end this. The truth about Shadow. They moved fast, cutting through back corridors, dodging pockets of gunfire. Adrian's mind raced as he followed Hart and Monroe, Shadow gliding beside him like a ghost. They're not regular mercenaries, Adrian said. They're too coordinated. Hart's jaw tightened. Because they're not mercenaries. Adrian's stomach twisted. Then who the hell are they? Hart exhaled. A black-budget paramilitary unit. They don't officially exist. No records, no oversight, just a directive. To do what? Adrian pressed. Hart hesitated. Then, to retrieve and eliminate experimental assets. Adrian's breath hitched. You mean dogs? Hart's gaze flicked to Shadow. I mean anything that works too well. It clicked then. Shadow was never meant to live this long. Whatever program had created him, they had wanted him terminated the moment they lost control. And now, years later, they had finally come to finish the job. Adrian clenched his fists. Over my dead body. Hart smirked. That's the plan. A second later, an explosion rocked the facility. The final stand. The blast took out the main power grid, plunging the underground bunker into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie red glows down the hallway. Go, Hart shouted. I'll cover you. Monroe pulled Adrian forward, but Shadow refused to move. The dog turned, watching Hart. Adrian knew that look. Shadow had seen something no one else had. Don't, Adrian warned. We need to stick together. But Hart was already raising her gun. And Shadow? Shadow was growling. At her. Everything happened at once. Hart fired not at the enemy, but at Shadow. Adrian lunged too slow. Shadow dodged, twisting midair with inhuman speed. The bullet grazed his side, but he barely flinched. Adrian tackled Hart. The gun clattered to the floor. Monroe stood frozen. What the hell is going on? Adrian pinned Hart down, his breath ragged. You set us up. Hart didn't struggle, didn't even blink. You should have let the dog die when you had the chance. Adrian's blood ran cold. This was never about saving the scientist, was it? Hart smiled, slow and cruel. No, Mr. Calloway. It was about you bringing Shadow straight to us. Monroe's gun wavered. Hart, what the hell are you saying? Hart's voice remained calm. That dog is worth more than any of our lives. He is the last of his kind. Do you have any idea what's in his DNA? What he's capable of? Monroe's gaze flicked to Shadow, who hadn't moved. Just staring. Calculating. The air in the bunker turned thick, heavy, almost alive. Adrian could feel its shift in the atmosphere, an almost imperceptible vibration, like the entire facility was holding its breath. The emergency lights were dead now, leaving only the distant flickers of sparking wires, the red glow of scattered control panels, and the slow, methodical sound of something moving in the dark. Shadow was rigid. His growl was no longer a warning. It was fear. And if Shadow was afraid, Adrian knew they were already out of time. Monroe tightened his grip on his rifle, his breathing sharp. What the hell is that? Hart, still pinned beneath Adrian, smiled. You really thought he was the only one left? She whispered. Then the thing in the dark moved. Fast. Too fast. The shadows blurred, and before Adrian could react, something slammed into Monroe. A sharp, wet crack. A strangled gasp. Adrian barely registered the sound of bone snapping before Monroe's body was ripped from the floor and dragged into the darkness. Gone. Just like that. Silence. Thena drip. A slow, steady drip of something wet hitting the concrete. Adrian's pulse thundered in his ears. Hart's voice was eerily calm beneath him. You were never going to make it out of here. Adrian's fingers clenched around her collar. What the hell was that? Hart exhaled, her expression almost pitying. The first one. Adrian went still. The first what? Shadow wasn't running. He was waiting. For something. A second later, Adrian heard it. A whistle. Soft, subtle, nearly imperceptible beneath the wind. But Shadow flinched. Adrian barely had time to process the reaction before the first shot rang out. Crack. The bullet missed Adrian's head by inches, embedding itself into the tree beside him. Adrian moved. He dove left, pulling Shadow with him, rolling behind a fallen log as another shot followed. Silencer equipped. No flash, no sound beyond the impact of metal ripping through wood. Sniper. Adrian's gut twisted. They were being hunted. Shadow's breathing was rapid, his body pressed low to the ground. But Adrian noticed something odd. He wasn't panicking. Shadow's eyes weren't darting around. He knew exactly where the shooter was. Adrian pressed a hand against the dog's fur, whispering, "How many?" Shadow's ears flicked, his body tensed. Then he moved. Before Adrian could stop him, Shadow broke into a sprint. Straight into the darkness. "Damn it!" Adrian growled, pushing to his feet and chasing after him. The forest blurred past. The gunfire stopped. Whoever had been shooting had realized. They weren't targeting just a man anymore. They were targeting something far worse. A predator unleashed. Shadow was silent. Adrian barely kept up as his dog cut through the trees, weaving between the trunks with supernatural precision. And then, a scream. Not a gunshot, a scream. Adrian skidded to a stop just in time to see Shadow emerge from the shadows, blood staining his muzzle. A body lay motionless behind him. A sniper, clad in black, throat torn out before he could even react. Shadow licked the blood from his lips. And then he looked up. Not at Adrian. At something beyond him. Adrian turned just as the second shooter moved. This one was faster, smarter. He anticipated Shadow's attack, sidestepping before Shadow's teeth could find purchase. The soldier swung his rifle, smashing it across Shadow's ribs. The dog let out a sharp yelp but didn't fall. Instead, he twisted mid-air, jaws clamping down on the man's wrist. A sickening crunch. The gun dropped. Adrian moved on instinct. He grabbed the fallen weapon, slammed the butt into the soldier's skull, and fired. Point blank. The forest fell silent again. Adrian's breath was ragged. Shadow, injured but still standing, looked up at him. Blood dripped from his muzzle, but his eyes were clear. Waiting. Adrian exhaled. Is that all of them? Shadow's ears twitched. His gaze flicked to the trees one last time. Then he relaxed. Adrian took that as his answer. The message. They moved fast. Adrian searched the bodies, stripping them of gear, ammunition, anything useful. Whoever these people were, they weren't government. No insignia, no dog tags, nothing. Ghosts. Adrian pulled a small encrypted device from the second shooter's pocket. A sleek black tablet, military grade. He powered it on, hoping for intel. A single message was displayed on the screen. Asset identified. Initiate retrieval. Adrian's blood ran cold. His eyes flicked to Shadow. Asset. Not terminate. Not eliminate. Retrieve. They weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to take him. Shadow's low growl confirmed what Adrian already knew. Whoever was behind this, they weren't done yet. And neither was he. Hart's lips parted to answer. But then the breathing started. Slow, deep, wrong. Adrian turned his head. The thing stepped into the dim light, and his stomach plummeted. The other one, it looked like a dog. At first, a German shepherd, same size as Shadow, same black coat, same calm, calculating gaze. But Adrian knew. It wasn't a dog, not really. Its head tilted slightly, eyes locking onto Shadow not with curiosity, not with aggression, but with recognition. It took a step forward. Shadow stepped back. Adrian felt a sharp, electric pulse of wrongness cut through his gut. Shadow never backed down. Never. But now? Now, his ears were flattened, his tail low, his muscles coiled not to attack but to run. And that terrified Adrian more than anything. Hart sighed beneath him. You don't understand what you've been living with, do you? Adrian barely heard her. He was too busy memorizing the details of the thing in front of him. It was sleek, like Shadow. But its movements were too precise, too perfect. And its eyes? God, its eyes. They weren't just intelligent. They were aware. Not like an animal, like something pretending to be one. Adrian's breath came shallow. This isn't just another prototype, he murmured. Hart's smirk returned. No, she said softly, this one is finished. A predator without a cage. The creature took another step. Shadow stiffened. Then, it spoke. Not words. Sounds. A low, clicking rumble, almost mechanical, like a fractured recording of a real growl. Adrian felt ice slip down his spine. Dogs didn't do that. Neither did machines. But this did. And then it smiled. Adrian froze. A dog shouldn't be able to smile. Not like that. Not with that slight, knowing tilt of the mouth, not with that slow, calculated reveal of two perfect teeth. Shadow snapped. Not barking, not attacking. A short, clipped warning. And for the first time, Adrian realized what he was really looking at. Not a mistake. Not a rogue experiment. A predator. One designed for one purpose. And it was hunting Shadow. The escape. Adrian moved fast. He released Hart, yanking his sidearm free and firing 2 rapid shots. The creature dodged. Not flinched, dodged. It moved before Adrian even pulled the trigger. Hart laughed. "Oh, you poor idiot," she murmured. Then the thing lunged. Shadow moved before Adrian could react. Faster than Adrian had ever seen him move. 1 second, the creature was mid-air, aimed straight for Adrian's throat. The next, Shadow collided with it, knocking it sideways, teeth slashing for the neck. The bunker erupted in chaos. Hart bolted. Adrian barely had time to see where before he was already grabbing the rifle Monroe had dropped, Hart hammering. Shadow and the thing rolled across the floor, a blur of black fur and gleaming fangs. And then Shadow yelped. Adrian's stomach turned. He never yelped. Never. The creature had him pinned. Shadow kicked up his back legs, ramming into its ribs, launching it back. It landed without a sound. Shadow scrambled up, breathing hard. His side was bleeding, deeply. Adrian snapped. He lifted the rifle, fired. The creature moved. But this time Adrian didn't aim for it. He aimed for the ceiling. Boom. The explosion tore through the bunker, sending debris collapsing between them. Adrian was already moving, grabbing Shadow by the scruff, dragging him backward as the roof caved in. The last thing he saw before the dust swallowed the room was the creature, standing perfectly still, its two human gaze locked on Shadow. And then it was gone. Out of the fire, into the unknown. Adrian didn't stop running until they were outside. The bunker was buried, sealed, no sign of the creature. Yet Adrian knew. It wasn't dead. It wasn't capable of dying. Shadow panted beside him, wounded but alive. Heart was gone. Monroe was dead. And Adrian? He had more questions than ever. Because if that thing was the first prototype, then what the hell was Shadow? And more importantly, why was he the only one they hadn't been able to control? Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked toward the distant tree line. Watching. Waiting. Because whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not even close. The cold night air felt suffocating. Adrian and Shadow stood at the edge of the forest, the destroyed bunker behind them, buried beneath rubble and fire. But Adrian knew it wasn't over. Not even close. Shadow was still staring into the trees, his ears pricked forward, his breath shallow. Adrian followed his gaze, but he saw nothing. No movement, no glowing eyes. No sign of the thing that had nearly killed them both. Yet the tension in Shadow's body told him everything. They weren't alone. Adrian's fingers tightened around the rifle. He exhaled, forcing his mind to slow down. Think. They had no backup, no vehicle. Monroe was dead, and Hart was gone wherever the hell she had disappeared to. They couldn't go back to the bunker. And if that thing was really still alive, standing here made them sitting targets. Adrian's instincts screamed at him to run. But Shadow? The cabin was silent except for the steady hum of rain against the windows. Adrian sat at the old wooden table, a dim oil lamp flickering beside him, casting long shadows across the walls. Shadow lay near the doorway, his side rising and falling with each breath, his wound freshly bandaged. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of wet pine and damp earth. They were safe, for now, but Adrian knew it wouldn't last. He reached for the encrypted tablet he had stolen from the sniper's body. The screen was cracked from the scuffle, but it still powered on. The last message still stared back at him. Asset identified. Initiate retrieval. Adrian ran a hand over his face. They weren't trying to kill Shadow, they wanted him back. His fingers curled into fists. Like hell. Shadow stirred, shifting slightly to look at him. Even in the dim light, his eyes gleamed with something too knowing. Adrian exhaled. You should be asleep. Shadow blinked slowly. A quiet moment passed between them. Adrian leaned back in his chair, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling. He had spent the last decade building an empire where he controlled everything. Every deal, every outcome, every move before it happened. And yet here he was, hiding in a rundown cabin in the middle of nowhere, hunted by people he still didn't fully understand, protecting a dog that shouldn't even exist. A dog he had raised. A dog that had saved his life more times than he could count. A dog Thaith now realized had been saving him from the very beginning. You were never supposed to be mine, were you? The words felt foreign leaving his mouth. Shadow didn't react. He just watched. Adrian let out a bitter chuckle. I should have known. He ran a hand through his hair. All these years I thought I was the one keeping you safe. Thought I was the one in control. His voice dropped to something almost raw. But it was you, wasn't it? Shadow's ears twitched. Adrian swallowed hard. You knew. About the people watching. About the danger. And yet, Shadow had stayed. Had chosen to stay. Not because he had to. Not because of instinct. But because, in his own way, he had been protecting Adrian all along. Adrian's throat tightened. He had never let himself get attached to anything. Not people. Not places. Not even the money. Because everything could be taken away. But Shadow? Shadow had been the one constant. And now, Adrian was starting to realize he might have to let him go. The choice. A low rumble of thunder rolled in the distance. Adrian pulled the tablet closer, fingers tapping against the screen. He needed answers. He needed to know exactly who was coming for Shadow and how far they were willing to go. He cracked through the encryption too fast. These people weren't just military, they were sloppy. Or, his stomach twisted. or they didn't care if he saw. The files were already open. No firewalls, no security traps, as if someone had left them there on purpose. His pulse picked up as he scanned the data. Coordinates, classified reports, surveillance logs going back years. His name was there. So was his address. But the information on Shadow? That went back farther. Much farther. Before Adrian had even adopted him. His heart pounded as he scrolled through the records. Shadow's litter, his genetic coding, handlers, training exercises, a termination order that had been issued and never carried out. His mind raced. If they had wanted him dead, why had he survived? Why had Shadow ended up in a high-end breeder's facility, ready for adoption, when every other prototype had been erased? And then he saw it. A single file. Redacted. Only one line of text remained visible. Do not terminate. Subject exhibits unpredictable variation. Observe in the field. Adrian's blood ran cold. They hadn't failed to find Shadow all these years. They had been watching, letting him live, letting him develop. And now they were coming to collect. He pushed away from the table, breath shallow. His hands were shaking. Shadow watched him, ears slightly back, body tense like he already knew what Adrian had just read. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something dangerously close to helpless. They had never been free. Not really. And if they kept running, they never would be. His jaw tightened. He looked at Shadow, really looked at him. He had spent so long thinking of him as a dog. But maybe he was something else, something more. And maybe that was why he had stayed. Adrian let out a slow breath. They want you? Shadow didn't move. A beat of silence. Then Adrian stood. Then let's give them a reason to be afraid. Shadow's tail flicked once. His ears pricked forward. And for the first time all night, Adrian saw it. Not fear. Not hesitation. But something terrifyingly close to understanding. The storm had settled into a steady downpour, thick sheets of rain hammering against the roof of the cabin. Thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, the sound barely audible over the storm's fury. Adrian had always trusted his instincts. They had made him rich, had kept him alive in rooms full of cutthroat businessmen and unseen threats. But right now, his instincts screamed that something was coming. Shadow sat near the door, his gaze locked on the forest beyond. His ears twitched every so often, his muscles coiled waiting. The hunt was about to begin. Adrian tightened the straps of the tactical vest he had taken from the dead snipers. He checked his rifle, then the extra magazine strapped to his belt. The moment he had found those files, the moment he realized they had been tracking Shadow all along, he knew there was no more running. They wanted Shadow? They'd have to fight for him. Adrian knelt beside his dog, pressing a hand to the sleek fur between his ears. I need you with me on this, buddy. Shadow blinked, slow and steady. Then, as if to answer, he turned his head toward the trees before the first flash of movement appeared. Adrian exhaled. Showtime. The first wave. It started with a single shot, a whisper of sound, nearly lost in the storm. The bullet slammed into the wooden doorframe, sending splinters flying. Adrian moved instantly, grabbing Shadow and rolling to the side as a second shot shattered the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into near darkness. They were here, and they weren't wasting time. Adrian didn't bother looking out the window. He already knew what he'd see. Ghosts in the trees. No lights, no sounds, just shadows closing in. He moved fast, grabbing the rifle and pressing his back to the wall. Shadow was already ahead of him, moving before the next wave of gunfire tore through the cabin. 3 shots, suppressed, precise. They weren't firing blindly. They knew exactly where he was. Adrian adjusted his grip, inhaled then fired back. The bullet tore through the window, striking something solid. A muffled grunt, a thud. One down. Shadow moved. A blur of black fur, disappearing through the back door, vanishing into the storm. Adrian followed, keeping low as another bullet whizzed past his ear. He hit the dirt behind an old overturned canoe just as more figures emerged from the tree line. 5. Maybe 6. Hart's voice returned, softer now. Did you really think it would be that easy? The thing that had once been O2 twitched violently, its spine arching upward. A horrific, wet crack echoed through the trees as its bones shifted. Number. Not shifted. Changed. Shadow's growl was immediate. Deep. Warning. Adrian raised his gun. Fired. The bullet tore through O2's skull. The body dropped. Silence. Adrian exhaled. Then, it started laughing. Adrian froze. Not a real laugh. A sound. A mockery of a laugh. Distorted. Twisted. A sound that no animal should ever be able to make. And then it spoke. Not in words. Not in English. But in the same clicking language from before. Shadow stiffened. And this time he responded. Not with a growl. But with words. Broken. Fragmented. More sound than speech. But Adrian understood one thing. Shadow knew what it was saying. The truth about Shadow. Adrian's blood ran cold. Number. The word slipped out before he could stop it. Because the realization hit him all at once. Shadow wasn't just a failed prototype. He wasn't just an outlier. He was a variable they couldn't control. A mutation. An evolution. And O1? O1 was never decommissioned. It was still out there. Still waiting. Hart's voice returned, softer this time, almost impressed. Now you understand. Adrian swallowed hard. What is he? A pause. Then, the next step. Adrian's breath hitched. Shadow wasn't a mistake, Hart continued. He was an anomaly. He broke every expectation, every limit we designed. He wasn't meant to be loyal to a human, wasn't meant to have attachment. She inhaled. But you changed that, Calloway. Adrian's stomach twisted. We watched him grow. Watched him reject every part of his original programming. Do you know what makes him different? Her voice dropped to a whisper. He chose you. A beat of silence. Then, a new voice. No static, no distortion. Just a whisper. Brother. The wind died. Adrian turned slowly. Shadow froze. From the darkness, a second pair of eyes blinked open. Not red, not black. Golden. The same as Shadow's. A shape moved in the darkness. Larger, stronger. Ye. Hart's voice was calm. It's time to come home. Adrian's heart slammed in his chest. Shadow stood perfectly still, not attacking, not running. Waiting. Because this wasn't a fight. This was a choice. Adrian swallowed hard. Then, in the quiet, he whispered, Shadow, what do you want? And for the first time, Shadow answered. Armed. Tactical gear. No insignias. Adrian exhaled. He had expected this. But so had Shadow. The first soldier didn't see it coming. 1 second, he was scanning the trees, rifle raised. The next, Shadow was on him. A flash of fangs, a scream cut short. Adrian didn't hesitate. While the others turned toward the sound, he fired. 1, 2. 2 more down. By the time the remaining 3 turned back toward him, Shadow was already gone again. They weren't just fighting a man. They were fighting something else. The game changes. A voice crackled in Adrian's stolen earpiece. They've got backup. It's not just a dog, it's static. Then, another voice. Cold, calculated, female. Enough. Bring the acid in. Now. Adrian's blood ran cold. Heart. She was still calling the shots. And if she was still this calm, that meant only one thing. This was still going according to plan. Adrian gritted his teeth, ducking behind a fallen log. Shadow had disappeared again, moving through the dark like a ghost. But Adrian knew him well enough to recognize a shift in his behavior. Shadow wasn't just attacking. He was leading, drawing the remaining soldiers toward something. Adrian's grip tightened on his rifle. What's your play here, buddy? A howl split the night. Not Shadow's. Something else. Adrian's stomach dropped. Then, the trees moved. Not the wind, not soldiers, something bigger. And Adrian realized too late that Hart hadn't sent these men to kill him. She had sent them to flush him out, to force him to run. Because waiting just beyond the clearing was the other one, the apex predator. Lightning flashed, and Adrian saw it. Tall, sleek, canine in shape, but wrong in every way. The first prototype, the one from the bunker, the one that had survived, its eyes gleamed in the darkness, locking onto Shadow. Not Adrian, not the soldiers. Shadow. Adrian's pulse slammed in his ears. This isn't an extraction mission. This is a replacement. They weren't here to retrieve Shadow. They were here to take him out, to eliminate the mistake. Shadow stood his ground, ears flattened, his muscles tight. Adrian had never seen him look like this. Not scared, not even angry, just prepared, like he had always known this moment would come. The other one took a slow step forward. Its movements were eerie, unnatural, like it was made of something lighter than flesh and bone. It studied Shadow, head tilting slightly. And then it made a sound. Not a growl, a whisper. Low, clicking, almost mechanical, the same sound it had made in the bunker. A language. A message. Shadow responded. A deep, guttural sound nothing Adrian had ever heard from him before. The other one's ears flicked. And then, it charged. The last stand begins. Adrian barely had time to react before the two collided. A blur of claws, fangs, and raw force. Shadow was fast. The other one was faster. They rolled across the forest floor, kicking up dirt, each trying to get the upper hand. But this wasn't a simple fight. This was designed. Adrian could see it, they were evenly matched. Because the other one had been built to be Shadow's replacement. And Shadow? Shadow had been built to be something else entirely. Adrian moved before he could think, raising his rifle. Hart's voice crackled over the earpiece. "Stand down, Calloway. Let them finish." Adrian ignored her. He had one shot. He aimed. The fight blurred together, rolling too fast, Shadow on top, then the other, snapping at each other's throats. Lightning flashed. A split second of clarity. Adrian fired. The bullet hit the other one in the shoulder. It reared back, snarling, not in pain but in surprise. Shadow moved. He lunged, jaws clamping down, and didn't let go. A sickening snap. The other one collapsed. Adrian held his breath. Shadow didn't move. The other one twitched. Then, its eyes flickered just once before going dark. Adrian lowered his gun. Shadow let go, stepping back, his sides heaving. It was over. Or at least, this part was. Because as Adrian looked down at the fallen creature, he saw something glinting on its collar. A tiny metallic tag. Subject 02. Adrian's stomach dropped. If this was 02, where the hell was 01? The storm had passed. The forest was quiet, now too quiet. Adrian stood over the fallen prototype, its lifeless body half buried in the mud. The metallic tag still gleamed under the faint moonlight. Subject 02. Adrian's fingers clenched around his rifle. If this was 02, where the hell was 01? Shadow stood beside him, blood dripping from his muzzle, his breath ragged but steady. The fight had taken its toll, but there was no relief in his posture. Only tension. Because Shadow knew it wasn't over. A soft static crackled in Adrian's stolen earpiece. Then her voice. "That was impressive, Calloway." Adrian turned, scanning the tree line. No sign of Hart, just the deep, suffocating silence of the woods. His grip tightened. "Show yourself." A dry chuckle. "Not yet." Adrian exhaled sharply. "You sent that thing to kill him. You make it sound so personal." "It is." Another pause. Then her tone changed. Amused, curious, almost satisfied. And yet, he survived. Adrian didn't respond, because he knew what she was really saying. Shadow wasn't supposed to survive. Not against another prototype. Not against his own replacement. And yet, he had won. Hart exhaled, almost like she was contemplating something. Then, "I think it's time we finally talked about Subject 01. A chill ran down Adrian's spine. The one that came before. "The truth is, Calloway, you've been asking the wrong questions." Hart's voice was smooth, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world. Adrian glanced at Shadow. The dog was still staring into the trees, his body unnaturally still. Listening. Waiting. Shadow wasn't the first of his kind, Hart continued. He was never meant to be the last either. But before there was O2, before your little prodigy. She let the words hang for a moment. Then, there was O1. Adrian's pulse thundered. Where is it? Another chuckle. That's the real question, isn't it? A gust of wind rustled the branches overhead. Adrian's grip tightened around the rifle, scanning the tree line. He didn't like this, didn't like being led. Shadow's ears flicked. Then, the scent changed. Adrian saw it immediately, the way Shadow's muscles tensed, the way his nostrils flared ever so slightly. Something was here, something close. Adrian's heart pounded. Then, the world tilted. Because the dead prototype, O2, started moving. Resurrection. Adrian staggered back as O2's body convulsed, its limbs jerking like a puppet on tangled strings. Its eyes flickered open, but they weren't glowing anymore. They were black,